Hello and welcome to BTE Media's In Conversation With series. I'm thrilled and privileged that exhibitions industry veteran Phil Soar has agreed to be with us today. Phil is chairman of 19 Events Group, chairman at CloserStill Media, the former chairman and owner of Nottingham Forest Football Club, and the former chairman of the Association of Exhibition Organisers. Good afternoon, welcome, Phil.
Good afternoon, Dan. Well, thank you.
Do you like the word veteran?
Not overly. I'm only 73, Dan. I got plenty of time left.
I was thinking what word to use, whether industry stalwart, veteran, but you never know which one could be offensive. Phil, moving straight on to the exhibition industry, where do we go from here?
Dear me, that's, we've only got 2 hours, Dan. What do we do? We wait, don't we? I mean, I don't think I've got any more profound views than anybody else.
Yeah.
We wait, and in our various markets, we lobby government so that sooner rather than later, we can begin to open up and do things. I mean, places where CloserStill operates, Germany and France, for instance, it has been possible to run a small number of events, quite a lot in Germany in the last 6 weeks. And of course, China has opened up for domestic events. We tend inevitably to focus on the UK because that's where we are. But for the big companies, and I suppose CloserStill counts as a big company now, it's only a minority part of our turnover, and therefore, while it's enormously important, we mustn't be totally blindsided by the UK and think only of what's happening in the UK.
Sure, absolutely, and obviously our European counterparts and the rest of the world, as you said, have opened up to a certain extent. And obviously we read that they're doing, conferences and exhibitions. Why do you think that is? I know obviously it's certainly to do with the ownership of venues, but what do you think the other reasons are?
Well, I don't think there's any question at all that the UK and the US have handled the virus considerably worse than Germany, France, Italy, despite the tremendous outbreaks in Italy early on. I think we perhaps exclude Spain from that. So we handled the virus relatively badly right from the start.
Yeah.
And therefore, compared with Germany, say, we're a long way behind what may or may not happen. I mean, the German performance, they've got a few problems at the moment, has been remarkable relative to ourselves. And I don't think there's been enough time spent looking at it and saying, how come they did it so much better than we did? So that's part of it. The other part, of course, is something that we've all been aware of forever. I've been over 30 years on the board of the AEO and its predecessor, the Exhibition Marketing Group. And I've lost count of the number of times I've talked to government ministers and senior civil servants and talked about the importance of the exhibition industry, the trade show industry is a better way to express it, actually. And tried to explain how valuable it is to the country, and how many times I basically just had a blank face. I mean, it is not a culture that is tuned into trade shows. It's not a culture that's tuned into exhibitions. You go and talk to the DCMS and you start talking about exhibitions and events, and they instantly think Glastonbury, or we can't have Glastonbury. We can't have anything like that.
Yeah. And
it's very, very difficult to persuade them that there is a spectrum of events, and at one end is Glastonbury and indeed Cheltenham, and of course they're very, very, very sensitive to the criticism they had over Cheltenham and also Liverpool versus Atletico Madrid.
Sure.
And they seem to find it terribly difficult to make a distinction between a trade show with 2,000 visitors and the Cheltenham Festival with 250,000.
And yet we saw only, I think it was last Sunday, there was Arsene Wenger's book launch at the London Palladium with 1,000 people. So
I speak as Arsenal's official historian. So I was particularly interested in that, although I didn't go to it. And
Yeah.
I've seen video of it. I have not the slightest idea why it's possible to do that, but not have 1,000 people a day in a hall at Excel or the NEC. I have absolutely no explanation. And as far as I know, nobody else has an explanation.
Well, I was listening to LBC last night, and I think it was Oliver Dowden, the culture and media
DCMS. Yeah.
His view was that it's more about the congregation outside and concourses, people, hospitality, food, beverages, that sort of thing. What's your view on that?
Doesn't actually make a lot of sense, does it? I mean, why should there be more if you've got 1,000 people or 2,000 people a day at the NEC, which after all is an enormous space? Why should there be a greater congregation than 1,000 people at the Palladium, which is a very cramped space in terms of entry and exit?
Yeah. What do you think events will look like, or exhibitions will look like in the future? Obviously, at the moment, we're doing this over Zoom, and there are lots of virtual events going on. What do you think when we do reopen? What do you think the events or the exhibitions, specifically, I guess, trade shows, will look like in the future?
I'm very, very sceptical of pronouncements that the world will never be the same again.
Yeah.
And that's perhaps because I've experienced far more crises of various kinds than you have, Dan, and many, many other people have. You have to go back, look at the history. I mean, the first recognizable trade shows were held in 1240, and the Holy Roman Empire gave a license to Frankfurt and Leipzig to hold trade shows in their cities, and he also forbade anyone to hold another trade show within 100 kilometers. That was 1240, and they were to hold annual trade shows. Okay. And actually, that's nearly 800 years, and the essence of trade shows has not changed since. Annual events, trade fairs, and crucially, you have the slot and you have the protection of the slot so that people can't run lots and lots of competitive events. And over 800 years, trade shows have survived wars, pestilences, floods, heaven knows what else. They survived the Black Death, they survived the plague, they survived numerous plagues, they survived Spanish flu. And I can't see a strong argument for saying they won't survive this in broadly the same format. I think trade shows are not like other media, but always assuming you recognize trade shows as a media form at all, and I'm not actually sure I do. They perform very, very different functions. They're about, as we know, groups of people who have common interests getting together, wanting to talk, wanting to meet, wanting to look at what everybody else is doing, wanting to do PR. Of course, there's buying and selling. I'm not suggesting there's not, but the intangibles at trade shows are actually more important than the tangibles, and that's why trade shows, and to a lesser extent consumer exhibitions, have not been affected by the digital wave in the way that every other media form has been, because trade shows perform a very different function, and those kind of basic human desires to get together with your peer group, to see what else is happening, to have something in your diary that says, I go away for 3 or 4 days and I do this and I talk to everybody I know. They're basic human instincts, and I don't think it'll go away. Having said that, rather like post-2008, of course there'll be changes to the landscape. There will be fewer events. There will be more holes in the calendar because, as we know and as we can see already, I mean, there will be a number of exhibitions, there will be a number of organizers, there will be a number of suppliers that don't actually survive this. And the longer it goes on, the worse that will become. I don't know where those holes will be. I mean, we all are watching out for it. We're all looking at it. We're all thinking about it. But for a time, as there was after 2008, there will be subdued activity. And between 2009 and 2012, and I'm quoting across the whole of Europe here, not the UK, there was a decline of more than 20% in net square meters across the majority of trade shows. And that, of course, was linked as much to recession as it was to the disruption of 2008, 2009. But it wouldn't be unreasonable to assume that we see overall something similar.
Sure. And I guess that also presents opportunities for companies like CloserStill. And I'm going to come on and talk about that in a minute. In terms of people I talk to, and just generally in the trade press, people are talking about hybrid events and fusion of digital and physical. So are you suggesting that you think we're going to go back to pretty much almost physical, or do you see a role for these virtual platforms?
It's a very, very difficult question.
Yeah.
There is a danger of trade show organizers chasing the Holy Grail and believing that digital, if you want to use the word digital, will provide an alternative platform. I mean, I was interested to see Hugh Jones at Reed saying that in 4 years they wanted Reed Exhibitions turnover to be at least 25%. Well, there are two ways of doing that, actually. Doesn't actually have to be an increase in digital revenues.
No, you could do your exhibition revenue, physical revenue.
I'm not saying I'm scared. There is clearly room for more digital offerings.
Yeah.
But it's horses for courses. Sorry, that's too much of a cliche. And it depends on what your products are, and it depends what your particular trade shows do. You need clearly a very good reputation, a very good place in the overall marketplace for a trade show, and you need very, very good databases. And then you've got the basis to do something. And if I can quote an example, one that you know well, Dan, is CloserStill's vet portfolio.
Yeah.
Absolutely dominating the marketplace, as good a database as exists within the marketplace, and the ability to reach all of those people, every vet supplier, every vet in the country with an offering. But having said that, and again, as you know very well, we already have an enormous amount of content at our vet shows. We have north of 100 sessions on all manner of subjects. I mean, last year, the most popular conference session was diabetes in rabbits. Amazingly, but true.
Who would have thought it?
Who would have thought it, exactly. And most of that content is put online anyway. I mean, in the sense we're doing it digitally. Yeah. We're saying to our database, we're saying to the vet community, there we are, it's available to you anyway. So that's an example of an area where there is already digital involvement.
Sure.
And there are plenty of other areas, but there are a hell of a lot of other areas where it really doesn't work in quite the same way. The most obvious one are retail shows, clothing shows, yeah. Gift shows, furniture shows, the ones that need touch and feel and face to face.
Well, because essentially that's Amazon, isn't it? If you want to shop without going somewhere physically, yeah. I guess you could say that Amazon is that, it's almost like a trade show, a suite of products that you can buy. Do you think certain business sectors, again from a trade show perspective, will come back stronger than others? So CloserStill specifically was obviously operated in tech, e-learning, obviously vets, pharmacy, and other healthcare offerings, and obviously technology. And I think primarily because they're more recession proof than others, or that was, I guess, the thinking. Do you think going forward, given what's happened, that will be the same again? So certain business sectors will thrive and others might be left behind?
Well, when we started CloserStill, which was I don't particularly want to talk about CloserStill because I have interest in quite a lot of other companies. But when we started CloserStill, which was effectively 2009, as you know, we had no staff, we had no shows, we, to all intents and purposes, had no money. But the one, although not so much guiding principle, but the one major thought process was try and invest only in areas which represent a growing proportion of GDP. And not just in the UK, it would apply in most other markets. And therefore, you tended to come to healthcare medical, you tended to come to IT, you tended to come to e-learning, you tended to come to e-commerce, which is where essentially the whole of the CloserStill portfolio is now. And in general terms, I would assume the situation is broadly the same. Again, this is not meant to be a discussion about CloserStill, but healthcare.
Well, no, I'm interested in industry sectors generally, Phil, like going forward.
Healthcare and medical would seem to me to be a strong sector to be in. E-commerce, e-learning, and the top end of IT, given everything we've seen, would seem to be strong areas to be in. Where I think you can detect what is happening is actually talking about rollover rates. And within the industry, the people that I talk to a lot, we have a lot of discussion about rollover rates. In other words, assuming you don't run any shows in 2020, assuming you do run them in 2021,
sure.
How many of your exhibitors, how much of your revenue have you been able to say, we can't do it this year, but will you just roll your revenue over to next year? And there is a big difference between the rollover rates in certain sectors.
Okay.
In security, in the broadest sense, security, cyber, etc., it's in the mid-90s. In healthcare and medical, it's in the low 90s. IT generally in the 80s. But if you look at retail, for a lot of reasons, one of which is that retail shows tend to be biannual, in other words, every 6 months.
Sure.
The ability to roll over at that kind of level doesn't really exist. And so as you look across sectors, you can use the rollover rate as a judgment as to how various sectors might emerge out of this in 21, 22.
Sure, and it also gives us an indication of the appetite for exhibitors within those sectors to still do face-to-face.
Yes, absolutely.
So great for the organizer, and great that it shows that sector's strong, but also great that exhibitors, at the moment they're happy to go on virtual exhibitions, but really the people I speak to, and I'd say for yourself and other people in the industry, they want to get back to physically exhibiting, because you can't replicate that online.
Exactly. We wouldn't be getting 90% plus rollovers without really any significant problems in doing so, unless those exhibitors, those customers were saying, we value the trade shows, we value the trade show, we want to be at the trade show. We don't worry, we're not going to argue about it. We'll be there when you next run it. We'll be there when you next run it. And it's a very, very good indicator as to which sectors are likely to suffer. Sure.
Obviously, at the moment, lots of people have had to move on from positions. Do you think the industry potentially is cut too deep, and possibly because there's no roadmap for reopening?
I think it's more to do with the fact that there's no roadmap. Yeah. I think if you could say to me, you will be able to run shows 1st of October next year, sure, or even the 1st of January 22, I would grab at that, because I would grab at the certainty. And with the certainty, you can say, that's okay.
Yeah.
We can work out what it's going to cost us. We can work out what staffing up to this level is going to cost us. We can talk to, in our case, the private equity company that has the majority of our equity, and say, this is what it will cost us to stay here. But at that date,
sure,
it will start up again. It's the lack of a date which is causing us all the problems.
And obviously, I know you don't have a crystal ball, but everyone's sort of packing the schedules from H2 next year, really. What's your view on that timescale?
Well, I can speak only for CloserStill, CloserStill and the other companies I'm involved in, where very, very early on, and I think April, May, we did our forward projections on the basis of not running anything before the last quarter of 21. That doesn't mean we won't run things before the last quarter of 21. I do think, certainly in France and Germany, possibly Singapore, that I think we will do so. But that was how we projected, because it was very, very important to go to the people that own the company, which in our case is Providence Private Equity Group, or in the case of Clarion is Blackstone, or in the case of Tarsus is Charterhouse, and actually say, this is what we think will happen. This is, if you like, if this happens and we do the following things, this is how much cash we will need. And we wanted to take something which at that point appeared on the pessimistic side of normal, on the pessimistic side of average, and say, this is what will happen. It was important to do that. We haven't changed that opinion very much, to be honest. It's now October 2020. I find it difficult to believe we'll be having the same conversations in October 21. We may well be.
Sure.
But I find it difficult to believe that that's the case.
And you mentioned private equity, and it's something I wanted to talk about. And I've obviously listened to your discussions before about the reasons why private equity have got involved within the exhibition industry, predominantly over the last 10, 15 years.
Yeah.
Do you think their confidence has been in the exhibition industry now has been rocked? So to the fact that you're going to see less private equity involvement going forward?
I think it would be nonsense to say that enthusiasm for the sector has been enhanced and is greater.
Sure.
But the reasons, the answer to the question when people say, why have private equity become so involved in the sector in the last 10 years, if you like? The real question is, why didn't they get involved in the sector much, much earlier? I mean, when we were building Blenheim up from nothing, Blenheim was a perfect vehicle for a private equity investment company or venture capital company. It took a long, long time for the pennies to drop. About cash comes in up front, very high margins, and absolutely crucially, the slots give you protection to protect the value of your business. It took a long time for that to come through. And those things I don't think change. I think from a PE point of view, the question isn't so much do they believe in the sector, but how would they value a company within the sector at this particular time? In other words, in 2018, beginning of 2019, which was the last time CloserStill did a transaction, multiples had reached a peak, if you like, which, from point of view of CloserStill shareholders, and you were one down, was a very positive thing. It's hard to see it going back to that peak anytime soon. I think the most likely consequence is the time scale between deals will extend. Sure. If you look at private equity deals in the sector, in the last 15 years, they averaged 3 years. In other words, in-out was on average 3 years. I don't think we're going to see that. I think we're going to see it taking 6 or 7 years for confidence to come back. But in the end, look at the stock market. Why is the Dow Jones where it is? Yeah. It appears to make very, very little sense. And of course, the answer is interest rates have ceased to exist and are about to go negative in the UK and are negative already in Europe. There is still an enormous wall of money. There is still an enormous amount of cash, and people need to invest it. And in that sense, private equity needs to invest its cash. And if you use the wall of money argument, there's no reason why a very good, well-run, solid trade show company shouldn't be extremely attractive in 5 years' time. Sure. I think the jury's out. I don't want to pretend. I don't want to sit here and say, no, I'm completely sanguine about it, because that would be idiotic thing to say. But I think most of the essentials are in place. I think, as I say, I think the real issue is that the timescale's longer.
Sure.
Rather than anything else.
Oh, it's interesting. You mentioned that why didn't private equity get involved previous? It almost, you can draw a parallel between how they view the industry or their knowledge of it to the governments at the moment in a funny way. So maybe generally the industry has an issue in that respect. Obviously, in any crisis, downturn, there are opportunities, especially for I guess cash-rich businesses or businesses that are backed by private equity that want to go off and do a buy and build strategy. Is that something that you think is going to happen for the businesses that you're involved with? Do you see opportunities there to buy up some territory both in the UK and outside?
Yeah, I don't think there's any secret about how the companies that are backed by private equity are thinking. They're being cautious, they're being thoughtful, but there's a broad consensus among them. And I think if you want to define it in a single sentence, it's probably that you don't want to be sitting here in 2025 saying that was the opportunity of a lifetime and we missed it. I mean, the time, I'm going back a long time now before you were born, Dan, but Blenheim's phenomenal growth from virtually nothing to be the biggest trade show company in the world was in 1991, where there was a very, very severe media recession and nobody else was investing and nobody else was buying. And for about an 18-month period, Blenheim bought whatever it could. And that was why Blenheim became the biggest exhibition company in the world. And CloserStill, it's not directly comparable, but the single biggest reason why CloserStill has been, and I think it's fair to say the success that has been, is because we began in 2009, 10, 11. We were out there launching vet shows, pharmacy shows, dentistry shows, buying learning technology shows, and nobody else was doing it. Everybody else was sitting back, sitting on their hands saying, times are tough, let's not invest. And the whole history of CloserStill was about what happened in that 3-year period when we were in the recession.
Sure. I think you're right. And actually, it's easy to get swept away in negativity. And actually, history, as you say, will show you that there are opportunities at this time. If you had some advice for a group of people, an individual that 6 months ago had a great idea for a trade show, but obviously they had to put it on hold, what advice would you give to them now in terms of potentially launching it in the future?
I talk to people quite a lot who friends and other people who in the industry who have ideas for a trade show or indeed a consumer show. And the first question I ask is when is the best time to launch it? And the answer is always last year, always.
Yeah.
Yeah. At the moment, depends on the idea.
Sure.
Depends on whether there's a hole. Start with the slot. Is there a hole If we're talking about the UK, is there a hole at the NEC? Is there a hole at Excel? Is there a hole somewhere else? If there's a hole, go along, start, think about it, and probably do it not before spring 22, just to be safe.
Sure.
But that gives a very, very long lead time, which means you're going to have the funding for a very, very long time, because you won't be getting very much cash flow in from that. But on the other hand, if you have the funding and you can do it and you can run that 18-month timescale, it may be, in retrospect, it may have been the very, very best thing you could possibly have done.
Sure. And do you always feel that it's best to have an opportunity to geo-clone it internationally? So if you're going to set up a show that actually is somewhere in the business plan, especially from an attractiveness point of view for investors, that they're looking for an event to be able to be cloned elsewhere?
Well, in an ideal world, you should be going into a sector which is in an area which is a rising part of GDP. And if that's the case, it's likely to be a rising part of GDP elsewhere. I wouldn't say that was an absolute. Okay. Sometimes, a really great opportunity. I'm speaking personally, nothing to do with CloserStill, but the arrival of the furniture show at the NEC in 2015 was an opportunity that was there and presented itself. There's no geo-cloning opportunity for that because there are furniture shows everywhere else in the world. Mm-hmm. But you see something, you see somebody does something, you see somebody moves a show from one venue to another, and you think, okay. And just keeping eyes and ears open on all the news that's going on in the industry. But no, I don't think geo-cloning is essential, but nice if you can do it.
Sure. And generally, Phil, in terms of the businesses that you're involved in, and feel free to pick and choose which one you want to talk about, what's next for them?
What's next? I mean, we sit and wait, obviously. In every single case, we sit and wait, but actually, we are probably spending, in terms of sitting around the boardroom table, more time talking about the opportunities that may appear over the next 12 months than we are talking about the existing portfolio and what's happening to the existing portfolio. So
that's positive. That's
yeah. I mean, in the case of CloserStill, in the case of 19, in the case of the other companies which I have as kind of sleeping investment in, we are talking to as many people as we possibly can about where they may be in 12 or 18 months' time. And it's very sad and it's very unfortunate that there are a lot of organisations who simply don't have the wherewithal to go to the bank or go to their parents and say, look, we need another 2 million, 3 million, 4 million, 5 million to tide us over. And they have to start thinking of other solutions. And so we are talking to a very, very large number of organisations, and we will see what happens. I mean,
sure.
What I would like to happen is the whole thing to disappear tomorrow and everybody to stop having to worry about it. But I feel that's not the case.
No. And we've touched upon the government's response to events and why that is. What if Boris Johnson was sitting in front of you here today rather than myself? What would you say to him?
I'd say to him, what are you going to do about the fact that you've got no money, Boris? And you're obviously really, really worried about it, aren't you? And you never wanted to be Prime Minister, did you? You wanted to have been Prime Minister. And actually, shouldn't you hand over to somebody competent, were it possibly the case that any member of your cabinet is confident? No, I think I'd be very, in a nice, pleasant way, rather abusive. I think it's I've never known a government, a cabinet,
right,
level of this quality before. In terms of you did actually mention when we were talking earlier about how has the industry performed here.
Yes.
I mean, having observed it and being involved in the AEO, I actually think Chris and Sarah and everyone at the AEO, and in particular Paul Tandy at the NEC, have actually done a superb job. I can't look at anything at all and say, actually, I think you could have done something different. I think you could have done it better. I think they've pushed, they've lobbied, etc. Because I've been talking to government or been involved in talks with governments for so long, I am very aware that this is not a culture. And this is certainly not a government or civil service culture which pays a great deal of attention to our industry. And I don't believe you can magically change that overnight. And after all, we are the only major city in the world that doesn't have a conference centre that can hold 5,000 people.
Yeah.
Which again,
which is amazing. Yeah, actually, it's unbelievable. Yeah,
of the attitude of government, of local authorities, etc., to the whole exhibition, conference, meetings
sure
area. I think I find it extremely difficult to come up with something that they could have done. I do know that Paul has spent a very large proportion of his life the last 6 months, and obviously Nightingale Hospitals is relevant as well, actually lobbying away, talking to DCMS and getting unbelievably frustrated with them. And I fear we're at the point now where, along with cruise lines, we are at the end of the line. We will be the last. We will be the last thing to be released.
Yeah. No, I think you're right. I think what the AEO and the other bodies, and obviously the CEOs of venues, have done a terrific job. But do you think it's shown that actually the industry hasn't done enough up until this point, when the pandemic started, to maybe have those ties with local and central government?
Again, I'm sorry to talk about the last 3 decades.
Yeah.
But we have tried, and we have tried, and we have tried in all sorts of ways.
Sure.
And when I was AEO chairman, which I was for 3 years, we set aside a very significant amount of the subscription revenue from the AEO to actually try to create some kind of, I call it a PR campaign, if you like.
Sure.
To try to work out how to reach government, how to actually get to them in such a way that we would actually influence them. And it's not just a matter of having a lobbying group and trying to speak to every single one of your MPs, etc. It can be a lot more subtle than that. It can, for instance, be, one big article in the Financial Times can be worth 1 million emails.
Sure.
And we spent a great deal of money. We spent something like half the subscription revenue for a number of years trying to come up with ways of reaching government. I confess, as being chairman at the time, we didn't succeed. I didn't succeed. And I'm not saying, Christ, let's all give up then. There are far better people than me, and there are far better brains than me involved in the industry who may well be able to find ways of doing it. I would only say that we have found it very, very difficult over a very long period of time, and maybe to an extent we're suffering from it. But having said that, I mean, look how influential the Premier League is, and the Premier League is still sitting there in front of empty stands, and is likely to be sitting in front of empty stands for another 6 months in the same way that we are.
Yeah. And obviously we've had the impact of COVID on the industry. We've got the Brexit agreement, whether it happens or doesn't happen, on the horizon as well. Do you have a view on that? And
yeah, I have a view, but I don't think you'd want to. I don't think you'd want to disseminate it. Although I suspect that my views are shared pretty much by 95% of everybody who's likely to see this. Yes, I mean, clearly at this point, there's very, very little to be said about the views of the 51.8% who thinks Brexit's a good idea. You did ask me, how did I think Brexit would affect the industry? I think if we're talking here in terms of the UK trade industry, then I mean there is clearly a short-term effect. There's clearly a short-term effect that a significant number of non-UK exhibitors will actually cross the UK off the list of, okay, we go to the big show in Germany, we do France, we do Italy, we do Poland maybe. Actually, UK's on the margins. On balance, it's now slipped below the 50%. Let's not do it. So I think we are bound to see that, but that's pinprick stuff. I mean, it doesn't come at you as a wave. It comes at you over a period of time.
Yeah, good point. Yeah.
But the UK is, with very, very few exceptions, like DSEI is a good example, World Travel Market's a good example. UK is a very provincial market, and therefore, in that sense, the effect of Brexit is relatively limited, not unimportant. I mean, you lose 3% of your turnover and it takes a hell of a lot of your margin, but it's not critical. Where it really is critical for the UK, of course, is GDP. And the best estimates I've read, not to mention the kind of commentary that one gets in the FT and the Economist all the time, suggest that over the next 10 years, Brexit will probably cost us about 10% of GDP. In other words, not that our GDP will fall from where it is 10%, but that it will be about 10% lower than it would have been if we'd stayed in the EU. None of us are capable of making that judgment. It doesn't seem to me an unreasonable position to take. It might be better, it might be worse. And that's where it affects UK trade shows. It affects UK trade shows because if GDP is smaller, the key is in the name. They're trade shows. They're about trade.
Yeah.
If trade in the broadest sense is going to be 10% smaller, then we are going to not be generating the revenue we would otherwise have been trading. And so I would have thought that's the significant effect. And it's an incredibly depressing subject.
Well, on a positive note, maybe, given that we can't run trade shows and we might not be able to run them specifically in the UK until H2 next year, it may well be that the impacts of the agreement at that point has already sort of dissipated. So I guess we live in hope. Moving on to the final part, Phil, if that's okay.
I would say one more thing about that.
Sorry, yeah.
In intellectual terms, not in practical terms, I think the saddest thing about COVID is that it will allow the very significant negative effects of Brexit to be concealed. That it will not be possible to say we have these problems because of Brexit, because COVID is so large, it will actually dominate, and it will never be possible to isolate the damaging economic effect of Brexit.
And so the cynics might suggest that's why we're going into more restrictive measures again to sort of push the story of Brexit over into the rough. In terms of leadership, Phil, and obviously you've run many businesses and obviously a football club. What do you think are the most important attributes of a successful leader? And just a follow up to that, do you think that's any different in leading in a crisis?
I think that's an almost impossible question. You know, you could go into Barnes and Noble in the States, and they have whole sections called leadership, and there are probably 1,000 books in there. I think in many ways it's the wrong question. I have known businesses where the leadership has been awful, and yet the business has been very successful. And I've known the reverse, businesses where they're absolutely great leaders and the business hasn't worked. And of course, it depends on what your business is. It depends on an idea or a product at a moment in time. And if you've got a great product at the right time, it almost doesn't matter how badly the company is run, you'll be successful. And the reverse is true. So I mean, apart from saying pure luck, obviously, I'm more inclined to think, why do some businesses work and why do other businesses work? And you kind of say a default that the people at the top are not complete fools. But I think it's much more about why certain kinds of businesses work and why other businesses don't work.
Okay. Well, then, obviously, you've hired many CEOs in your time as well. Yeah. But I guess when you're looking at them, whether they've come to you with an idea or not, are there specific traits that you look for?
Yeah. I mean, I'm sorry if it's a terrible cliche, but it's about hiring other people, isn't it? It's about actually being able to say, okay, we are this, and what matters is, you know, the 10 people at the next level down and the 20 people at the next level down below that. The Biden-Trump thing is really interesting because basically all that Biden needs to do if he wins is not for him to be a great demonstrative president going out dramatic things. What Biden needs to do, and seems to me he will do, is actually hire a very good cabinet and fill those 1,000 critical positions which Trump has allowed to be left unfilled or to be given to very unsuitable people, to actually hire all those people to actually run the government and the agencies far, far better than they have been run in the last 4 years. And if he does that, he doesn't need to do anything else. And that to me is the essential thing. I mean, you know, secrets of success: number one, intellectual rigor, really important. Number two, determination, because it's surprising how many people are not that determined. And number three, you can call it serendipity or you can call it luck, but the last one is the most important one of all. And anyone who thinks that they have built something because they're brilliant and they're a genius. It all depends on them. Is deceiving themselves and is lacking intellectual rigor, I suspect.
Sure. And you mentioned Trump. I just want to just briefly talk about him and obviously the US election. What's your views on him as in terms of the way he uses social media platforms to communicate with his base, etc.? What's your view?
I certainly don't think I've got any profound views. If anybody wants to really follow the US election, they should look at a website called Nate Silver 538. Spelt as it sounds, Nate, N-A-T-E, Silver 538. And he's absolutely brilliant, and he is by far the best commentator on the election, and his predictions are by far the most reliable. And in 2016, the week before the election, his odds were 69% Clinton, 31% Trump. He was not somebody saying it's 95% Clinton. He was saying Trump's got about a 1 chance in 3 of winning, and he was by far more accurate than anybody else. What do I think? My wife's American, my children are American. I am preparing for a terrible night if it goes wrong. My wife is saying she'll give up her citizenship if
really, right?
Yeah. It goes wrong, that she'll never ever go there again. It's weird, isn't it? If you view it from here, although we're not particularly viewing it from here because we have a house in the States, and before all this, we spent a lot of time there. 44% of the people that vote in this election will still vote for Donald Trump. And it's really, really difficult to get your head around why, after the last 12 months, that is the case. I think it's confirmation bias that if you actually say, okay, this is the man for me, then it's almost impossible to persuade people that they made a mistake, therefore they're going to do the same thing again. Social media, as you say, but directed at the base, very much directed at the base, not seeming to actually have any particular cut through outside the base. And I have to remember this, the last election, 4.5% of the votes went to independents. And that was very much a kind of liberal Democrat green vote. In other words, none of the above. And a lot of it, most of it, was judged to be people who would normally have voted for Clinton but couldn't bring themselves to vote for Hillary Clinton, but they still felt strongly they wanted to vote. This year, the independent vote's not expected to be more than 1%, which gives you 3.5% of people who are the ones that Trump actually needs to actually add to his vote. At the moment, the indications are that's not where it's going. But to be fair to Nate Silver, he's saying 87-13 at the moment, as of this morning, which is still 1 chance in 7. And even that's very, very worrying.
Sure. Well, we live in hope. What generally, in your opinion, are the main differences of running exhibitions in the States to Europe?
Slots. Throughout Europe, you've heard me say this many times. The key to the trade show industry, the key to understanding the trade show industry, is understanding how slots work.
Sure.
It's the slots that give you the protection. It's the old British Airways and Heathrow argument in the days when there used to be an airline called British Airways. You might remember it, Dan, and they used to fly in and out of Heathrow. Olden times, may never happen again, but British Airways, one of the most profitable airlines in the world for the last 40 years. Why? Because they control 50% of the slots at Heathrow. And nobody can take those slots away. And by and large, the exhibition industry, by and large, in Europe and other places in the world, works off slots. So if you've got your slot, nobody can take it from you. That's where the value is. The US is different because there are so many different places you can run exhibitions. There are 1 or 2 places like Vegas where the particular slot is important, but even there are plenty of places where you can run events. So the single biggest difference, apart from the size of the market, obviously, is the fact that slots don't give you control of the market.
Sure. And finally, Phil, what do you think your greatest achievement is from a business perspective, if you had to pick one?
If you were talking to my wife, she'd say none at all, quite legitimately. Although it was quite a long time ago, I think winning the Japanese Publisher of the Year award.
Wow.
And that was back in the 1990s.
Yeah.
I started going out to Japan in about 86, at a time when, again, you're too young to remember, Dan, but a time when...
Keep flattering me with the young comment.
Well, Japan at the time was perceived to be a very closed market, obviously, and very, very hard to get into. It was very much an export market. But I was running a publishing group called Agostini at the time, an Italian group. And I actually thought that Japan was a perfect market for our products, which it proved to be. But actually getting out there and actually, I didn't know a single person in Tokyo. So getting out there and actually finding a way of launching the business and persuading the distributors, the equivalent of WH Smith, if you like, to actually carry our magazines. It took about 2 years. And eventually we did manage to launch. And after about 2 years, we had in terms of copy sales, the biggest magazines in Japan. And so we won that award, which I was very proud of, because apparently no other non-Japanese has ever won it. So I think that probably counts. It's very obscure. It's a totally different part of the world and a long, long time ago.
Sure. Well, it's interesting because I think, and I for myself as well, when I ask people that question, they tend to go back to an early part of their career. And possibly it's because that's when they were not as experienced. So they felt it was a bigger achievement to do that, given the level of experience they had. It's almost like when you get old and you've got the experience, yes, you've done something great, but you almost say to yourself, well, yeah, fair enough. That's because I'm experienced at doing what I'm doing now.
Yeah. I just to follow up on that,
yeah.
I think if you take more recent times, very, very personal, I think winning the Sunday Times 100 best companies to work for in 2018, 2019 and 2020 was something that pleased me enormously. I mean, that is a very, very, very rare achievement, and nobody in the trade show industry has done anything like it. But to do that in 3 consecutive years was something I think we're all very, very proud of.
Predictions for the football season, if you have any?
Nottingham Forest won't get promoted, I'll tell you that. Nottingham Forest are on a run of 8 consecutive defeats at the moment, which is almost a record. It's an interesting season, isn't it? Because the lack of fans is clearly affecting how people are playing. Hard to see, but it'll be in the end, it'll be anybody but Liverpool or Manchester City.
Yeah.
But it is quite interesting. I mean, a lot of the games are interesting. It was wonderful last weekend. Yeah. Or do I mean the weekend before?
Yeah, the 2, Man United and Liverpool game.
5-2 and a 7-2 and a 6-1. That was absolutely wonderful. Just wonderful to see Spurs. Again, I'm also Spurs official historian. Wonderful to see them winning at Manchester United 6-1. Yeah. Liverpool or Manchester City would be crazy to say anything else.
Yeah. So Phil Soar, thank you so much for your time today.